I appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today. A lot of new faces, and that's good. And got some young people here. It's always good to see young people here also. I was not able to be here for the other chapel talks on the same topic, so I hope that I don't repeat everything that was already been said. When I was leaving a church many years ago in Kentucky, the Sunday before the three guys came to try out for the position I was leaving open, I used a sermon illustration about the devil selling some of his tools, and he was selling one tool more expensive than all the others, and that was a tool of discouragement. You've probably told that same story in a sermon. The first guy that tried out for my position, he used that same story, and everyone thought that was very humorous. The next Sunday, the second guy trying out, he used that same story. Well, it wasn't quite as humorous. And they told me that when the third guy came, for me to be sure and tell him not to use that same story. Well, I hope that I'm not going to repeat everything that's already been said the last couple of weeks on this topic as you're talking about faith and doubt. A few recommendations that I would make on dealing with faith and doubt. First of all, read widely. Don't simply read from people that you agree with. In the class that I taught here a time or two that Justin Imel is now taken over, I've been using for the last few years in this class that I also teach down at Ambridge, I've been using as one of the textbooks a book written by an atheist. And at first, my students, when they look at these three textbooks, two of the textbooks written by evangelical apologists, and then one textbook written by one of the top atheists in the world, they kind of wonder, has the instructor gone crazy? Why is he giving us a textbook by an atheist? And as the students start reading this, the typical reaction by most of my students is they're angry. You know, why is this guy saying these things about Christianity? Why is he saying these things about Christ? Why is he saying these things about the church? But the further they get into the book, they're not afraid of him. I think their anger at first is based upon fear, that they're not going to be able to handle what he has to say. But the further they get into Dennett's book, they realize that his arguments aren't very good. And by the time they finish his book, I start asking them, well, what do you think of his arguments? They say his arguments aren't that strong. Do you think you could debate him? And most of my students think that they can take on one of the top atheists in the world. And they have no fear. And they're willing to go out and they're willing to read literature written by atheists. And this brings up what I think is a fundamental factor that you need to realize as far as faith and doubt. The fool in the Bible is not someone who's intellectually incompetent. And for my Old Testament scholars here, I hope that I'm correct in this. The fool is primarily a rebel, a moral reprobate. Is that correct? I'm getting a nod from my Old Testament scholars. Okay, it's not somebody with a low IQ. It's somebody who is rebelling against God, and so he beats his head against the wall because he's fighting against God. Some of the atheists in the world are some of those brilliant people in the world, but they're blinded to the evidence because they don't want to submit to God. And that is the problem. And so as you go out to study with people, the key is not you finding the right argument always. The key is not you finding the right Bible verse. The key is, are they willing to repent? And so you may not succeed in converting somebody, And it may not be your fault. They've got to be willing to bend their knee and say, Jesus is Lord. And so read very widely. Be willing to read not only from those who believe in God, be willing to read from those who do not believe in God. A second thing that I would suggest is try to create an atmosphere in the church where people can openly talk about their doubts. Who would you want your kids to go to talk about drugs? Just to the drug dealers? No, you want them to go and talk to the school teachers, to those significant people in authority where they can get the good information. You would want them to go to talk to their youth minister. Well, where do you want people to go when they're talking about their doubts? You want them to be able to go to talk to youth ministers, preachers, school teachers, and people like that. We need to create an atmosphere where people can talk about these things in a healthy way. So let's try to create the proper atmosphere. A third thing that I would suggest is you need to be able to keep your heart pure. Because again, doubt is not primarily an intellectual issue. It's primarily a moral issue at its base. You've probably seen the same thing as I have. You've seen some people who all of a sudden, they quit attending church. Sometimes you've seen a marriage fail. And a man will leave his wife. You'll find out that he's having an affair. A marriage fails. Children are hurt. He says, well, I never believed all of that stuff anyway. And all of a sudden he starts talking about problems in the Bible and there's really no evidence for God's existence and so forth and so on. Which happened first? Did he lose his faith first, or did the moral problems arise first? Most of the time, maybe all of the time, I think the moral problems arose first, and then he tried to intellectually justify it by bringing up all of these intellectual questions. If you'll keep your heart pure, then all of these questions and these doubts that are out here, you can deal with them. And they really won't be that difficult to deal with. But if you're having moral problems, if there's trouble in your marriage, or if there's some addiction that you're dealing with, then these problems you have with the existence of God, or these problems you have with the Bible, is it really God's Word? You're going to struggle with those. So keep your heart pure. Okay, the last thing that I want to share with you is what I really deal with at some length in my class in philosophy of religion. And I want to give you the thumbnail version of it. I spend about 10 hours in lecturing, so I've got to summarize that in about 10 minutes here. So it's going to be a quick summary. Have you noticed how little evidence it takes to convince some people that God exists, that Jesus is the Christ, and that the Bible is His Word? It just doesn't take any evidence to convince some people. On the other hand, have you noticed that you can present 1,000 arguments, fulfilled prophecy, historical accuracy, philosophical arguments, and on and on and on it goes. And you can present a mountain of evidence to some people, and that doesn't mean anything. I don't believe that. And they can give you quibble after quibble after quibble. Why is that? I believe it's because that is the way God created the world. This is the best of all possible worlds that could be created for several different reasons. God created the best of all possible worlds to test us. It's not the best of all possible worlds for several other scenarios. It's the best of all possible worlds to test us to see what kind of people we are. Now, let me try to explain a few things along these lines. Davis, in his little book, Philosophy of Religion, points out something about Adolf Hitler. And one of the things that I read outside of religion is I like to read a lot about World War II. Why did Adolf Hitler attack England? And why did he attack France and Belgium? Why did he open up a front on the west and on the east? Why did he open up two fronts? His generals told him it's almost impossible for Germany to win the war if we have two fronts. It's because Adolf Hitler was corrupt, and that caused him, because of the corruption in his own heart, to make a miscalculation. He thought something about Franklin Delano Roosevelt that caused him to miscalculate. You see, the United States is right here, Canada is right here, we've got a long border between us, and Adolf Hitler thought, if I try to attack England and Great Britain, Franklin Delano Roosevelt will think that England is so preoccupied with fighting Germany, the United States will take that as an opportunity to take Canada. Crazy. We don't want to take Canada. We don't think that way. Why would he think that we would do that? It's because if he was president of the United States and Germany attacked England, he would say, oh, this is an opportunity for me to take Canada. That's what he would do, because he took Austria, he took Czechoslovakia, and he attacked Poland. I mean, that's the way he behaved. And so because of the corruption of his heart, he ignored evidence. And see, this is the way that God created the world. He hasn't given us overwhelming evidence of His presence. You can't just walk out the door and see God. We talk about Christian evidences. How evident is God? People talk all the time, well, I talked to God this morning. I say, well, how did you talk to Him? Well, you didn't pick up the telephone and talk to Him. Did He answer? I knew a lady back in the early 1970s, and she claimed that she talked to God all the time, and He told her that the calf was sick out in the barn in the middle of the night, and they went out in the barn, and one of the calves was sick. She told me that she pulled up to the stop sign one time, and she looked both ways and started to pull out, but God told her, don't pull out, and she looked, and there was a car coming, actually. I never believed that God talked to her in those ways all the time. I think there was something else really going on, that she actually saw the car out of the corner of her eye, and then she just looked a second time anyway. God isn't really evident in that I can actually see Him and He's not talking to me. God has given us enough evidence so that if I want to believe in God, my belief is rational, my belief is logical, and I can go about life and manage my faith in a consistent way. And I can be a rational, logical person. But if I don't want to submit to God, then I can quibble on it. And I can be like an Adolf Hitler, and I can push that evidence off to the side, and I can do things like he did when he attacked England. And I can deny that evidence, and I can deny that sort of belief. Now, where do I get these ideas? These ideas, I would suggest to you, are found all the way through the Old Testament, especially in the wisdom literature, like Ecclesiastes, in the book of Job. It's found in the New Testament. It's found in a lot of other writings throughout history. I would recommend to you the Japanese Catholic writer, one of my favorite writers, Shisako Endo. I would recommend you, somebody's smiling because he's heard all of this before. I would recommend you read Holocaust literature, and you'll find a lot of it in there. Look up on the internet, Luther's Theology of the Cross. Luther wrote what is called the Theology of the Cross in contrast to the Theology of Glory, which was the theology of the scholastics of the late Middle Ages. This is written about by many of the philosophers. Originally, I got these ideas from Pascal, the great mathematician. I thought that I'd mostly come up with these ideas myself. I didn't realize that I had read them in Pascal's Pensées back in the early 1970s, and then I'd lost my copy of Pascal. And then I pulled some of these ideas from a few other sources, and then I plugged them into my lecture notes, and then I found them again in Pascal's Pensées, and many years later I read them all over again. I just want to read you one statement from Pascal's Pensées. This is from fragment 578. He says, there is sufficient clarity, that is, in the evidence that God has given us in the world and in nature of His existence. There is sufficient clarity to enlighten the elect. There is sufficient clarity for the existence of God so that those who want to believe can believe, and sufficient obscurity to humble them. In other words, God isn't just standing right here where I can see Him and touch Him. So I've got to search for Him so I can be humbled in the fact that I have to search. He says there is sufficient obscurity to blind the reprobate. Somebody like this who doesn't want to believe in God, God hides just enough so that because this guy doesn't want to believe in God, he quibbles on the evidence. And so he writes books on atheism. But yet there is enough evidence for God's existence. So here's what Pascal says in conclusion. There's sufficient clarity to condemn them and make them inexcusable. So on Judgment Day, unless Dennett repents and believes, on Judgment Day, he doesn't have an excuse. Nowhere, though, do I find this argument more powerful than 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And I'd like to read two verses again that were read to us a little bit earlier. For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. If we had created God, what kind of God would we have created? The last God that we would have created would have been a God that would have been born and laid in a feeding trough, and who would have been killed by being hung on a cross. And that's why God came to us in that way. And then in verse 25, for the foolishness of God, the so-called foolishness of God, is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul lays this approach out, I think, more clearly than you'll find it anywhere else. in all literature. Well, I hope I said something that'll be helpful to you. If you occasionally have doubts, don't be concerned about it. Just about every other believer that has ever thought deeply at all has struggled with doubts at one time or another. If you'll keep your heart pure, and if you'll pray, then you'll be able to deal with those doubts. So thank you for considering my thoughts today.